Now, there's two things that I need to get a better idea of in terms of that chassis that you have built so nicely with these diagrams. And these are huge. These are, if you will, arguably make or break. They're the biggest things that I've got regarding your game. The first one is, and this could take us days, so let's try not to, is the role of setting. And I would urge you, since you've got, as I wrote in the post, I don't know if you saw that, you have a much stronger influence by writers like Robert E. Howard and Fritz Leiber than you do from any other fantasy. Arguably, perhaps a bit of Clark Ashton Smith. And also the later writer from the 70s, Carl Edward Wagner, with the Kane stories. These are furious, hallucinatory, am I or am I not a protagonist today? You know, in the positive sense. How good are my intentions? As we mentioned before, you know, what worth are my good intentions anyway? You know, should this particular story end up with everything in the shit? Well, that's just the way it went. And so, you know, a certain amount of existential level of endurance, if you will, but it's always a choice to keep going. Right. And so, and the world isn't really providing you with a whole lot of rationale for that choice. So that's sort of my quick thematic and literary underpinning that I really get out of what you wrote. It's both in the introduction that you wrote, like the generalizing about the setting, and then when we look at the features. Now, setting is either role-playing's greatest achievement, or it's its greatest curse, in my humble opinion. When setting exists so that it's easy and fun to come up with situations. Because we don't experience setting in play. We experience situations in play. A very local situation where I am. And if you look at the setting and you go, aha, this is the situation, then it's doing its job. And it can also play a character-based situational role in you say, well, I'm from here. And I'm from here in a particular way. I'm from here as its representative of the powers that be there. Or I'm from here as an escapee from the wretchedness there, or something. But you are situated relative to a place because you're from there. With all of the ethnic and societal and, you know, nuances that may suggest. So, therefore, setting can really feed into situation because it feeds into things through the lens of my character, where they're from, whether we're there at that place or we're somewhere else. I mean, after all, Howard never wrote a story set in Cimmeria. Right. At the closest he ever came was in the neighboring country of Vanaheim. One very brief story. Otherwise, Cimmeria was just somewhere Conan was from. So, so either that, or, you know, we could have stories set there, in which case you're like, you know, local, and you have direct relations with the powers that be. So, okay, so that's you, but there's also, wherever we're located, you're looking at the situation there, and you say, aha, this is the kind of shit that goes on there, and we see it through that situation. Do you see, I'm saying that the gazetteer approach to setting is actually not that useful in play. And I also have maintained that most of the fantasy authors in history, the really great fantasy authors and the most beloved settings, were not, contrary to fandom, built through a Swiss watch mechanism of the author knowing it all and then writing the stories. It's the other way around. They wrote stories and the setting built into place through the accumulation of the stories. And some of this is extremely explicit. The Fafhrd and Mouser stories were actually originally set in a more historical Middle East. Lankhmar was actually Tyre. And only later did they repurpose them into a more fantasy setting. Exactly when that happened, I don't think is known, or at least I don't, when they started like replacing all the historical names with the fantasy names. The same thing goes for Michael Moorcock. All of his, whether the Young Kingdoms themselves for the Elric stories, or the cosmology of Moorcock as it eventually developed, either way, I mean, he wrote 3 Elric stories with an extremely vague notion of where anything was or what anything was, throwing in tons of terms just for fun. And then when the character caught on, he went back and wrote in tons more stories to round out the saga. But that story already contained Elric's death. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that so many of these fantasy settings, Howard is a fantastic example. The point being that they didn't have this vast setting first and then know what to write because their character was there. Exactly the opposite of what fantasy fans want. Fantasy fans want there to be this beautiful setting that really exists in a shimmering way somewhere in the author's mind, and then they went and wrote their little adventures in it. That's not what happened. So what I'm saying is that for your setting, it is only functional insofar as we're able to build situations out of it. Both from the Dunesmith's point of view, by looking at the map and saying, okay, we're here, and what goes on here, and from the character's point of view, I'm from here, so how does that inform how I face whatever situation I'm in? In 100 ways. So that's what I'm driving at. That's what setting is for. Setting is so that our situations pop. And in many ways, the causality is the reverse of what you expect. By playing that situation effectively and with great enjoyment, then we have setting. Then we feel like the setting's really there. But I don't care how many pages you flip through reading about setting, it won't give you that same feeling.
Right.
It's only really there after we play a situation. So in your case, since you're not doing what Sorcerer and Sword does, which is to simply run adventures and then build the map as you go, sort of literally recapitulating Howard in that case. Often coming up with a cool name as a throwaway and then, much later going, oh, well, let's set an adventure there. Instead of doing that, you actually do have somewhat more of the classical situation of, okay, I'm laying stuff out. We know where things are. And there is, some fixed stuff that we've got. And that's okay. But the logic of play remains. It's not going to be real to the experience of play until we see a situation that brings it into relevance for our characters and our decisions as players. If that's fair to you, then let's take a look at how that happens. One is that business through the lens of the player, which I think you kind of have, because you've got the stock. But one thing we don't have is a region per character. If any Asteri is like any other Asteri based on that alone, and it doesn't matter where they're from, then I wouldn't care about this. But I don't think that's where you're going with this. That would be the situation like you find in many games, like where you say, well, I don't really give a fuck about setting, but I'll play the dwarf. Well, where's my dwarf from? I don't know. Tell me where I'm from. I'm a dwarf. That's all we need to know. I know how to play a dwarf.
Right.
But here, I think if we want setting to have that focusing power of making situations matter, not only should my fellow be an Asteri with all these, relations, but it's going to make a big difference where I am in arcane exile from. So do you see how actually having a place on the map to point to and say, my dude, if he's, and he's a wayward soul, he's an arcane exile and a tavern drunk. That means he started here and now he's here. And maybe that now he's here can be wherever the Doomsmith says, based on our books and things. That's cool. I get that. But what about the starting point? And I think that actually kind of matters. I have an essay you might like. It's called A Setting an Emergent Story.
Okay.
And I'll send you the link
to me.
Yeah, I'll send you either the PDF or the link to where it's sitting right now. And it's all about how you take a game with a developed setting and you actually have the setting matter to the situation. And one of the things that it talks about is that having all of the options for player characters available to you may not actually be the strongest approach. Instead, name a localized spot and say who's there or could be there and pick from that. And one thing you don't allow is what I call the wandering samurai. You say, well, we're going to play in Renaissance Europe. I'm playing the wandering samurai. We're going to play in the Caribbean. I'm playing the wandering samurai. He's there. You see that particular tactic? Just completely obviates the point.
Right.
So I'm talking now, one can go too firmly with this. One can go too firmly and say, well, here's the spot. You got to pick one of these two things you can be. That's a little too much. But the point being that if you have the spot and everybody commits to having characters who have, if for lack of a better word, a place in that spot, then the opportunity for emergent story is much more powerful, and you'll have a lot less Brownian motion of the characters that would be just the same no matter what spot you pick. And you also avoid the problem of the A-team, which is the diverse merc band going from place to place, or I guess you could call that the next generation, right? We're all very, very diverse, but we're really just this band. And put us wherever you want. We'll do our thing. Right. And so both of those effects are very fine for some ways to play, but they don't match well with your way to play, which is to be highly situational. Do you or don't you kill this guy? You don't have a yes or no. It all depends on who's this guy, where are we, who am I, what's happened, and what could happen. It's incredibly local per session, right? Whether you want to kill this guy or not. Am I reading that right?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so with that in mind, this whole idea of setting as a way to form situation, and that situation comes both through the character lens and through the Doomsmith talking about this particular spot, is no small thing. It's a big deal. So how do you introduce setting? Now we get to the text problem. How do you introduce setting in that regard? That's tough. And if you introduce it as a gazetteer, you actually kind of ruin your point. If you present setting as there's 72 races and 82 character classes, you just create a broad spray of nothing. And everybody will have one race and one character class, but so what? So it seems to me that if you were to sort of characterize a particular place, then it doesn't dictate anything. I can still play my Asteri, but the fact that I can say, oh, well, he's an arcane exile, but he didn't go very far. As opposed to, oh, we're playing here? Holy cow, well, he's an arcane exile, and look, he crossed a whole continent to get there. He's really outside his zone. I mean, that matters to me, right? I mean, I can really say that about my character now.
Mhm.
So that's kind of an interesting point. The role of origin, regional origin per character, not just lineage, and the role of where we actually play.
Gotcha.
So this is what I mean by the role of setting, how it relates to how we experience play.
Okay.
So that's something to keep in mind, because I was looking at this and I kept kind of keenly, my character, I mean, you didn't see what I said at this, I'm looking at this and you can't even see what I'm like touching over here. I'm touching the notes for my character. And the idea is I'm looking at that and I really like all the stuff that we saw, but without that idea of where that damn tavern is and where he's an exile from. You see, if he's an exile from somewhere and the tavern's in roughly the same place, then he's an embarrassment, right? He's still sticking around drinking. Everybody wants him gone. But there he is, embarrassing. I have to walk past him to the wizard place like every day, and there he is, sucking on his bottle. God, I hate looking at that guy. Right? Or, that's one thing. Or, exile in this case means more literally he really is way the hell away from wherever it was. Either one is fine, but it's nice to know which as I'm making them up, as I'm making further choices, right? If he wandered away for 20 years, then that's going to be really different. Maybe I'd want to come up with more of a badass. He's had to take care of himself with a sword. Whereas if you just went down the street and went into the tavern, no less in exile, but definitely, local, then the kind of skills that I come up with might be a little different.